The slave market was loud, filled with the sound of shouting voices and the clinking of metal chains. The air was heavy with the smell of dust, sweat, and strange alien spices. Merchants from many worlds had come, each looking for something they could buy cheap and sell for more. Bright lights from the auction stage made the prisoners squint as they were pushed forward. One by one, strong workers, rare entertainers, and dangerous fighters were sold quickly, their prices rising fast as the crowd shouted over each other. At the far end of the stage, almost hidden in the shadows, there was a small rusted cage. Inside sat a thin alien girl, curled up with her knees against her chest. Her skin was pale, almost gray, as if the color had been drained away by years of hunger and cold. Her long hair hung in tangled strands, covering part of her face. One of her legs was twisted in a way that showed it had never healed properly after an injury. The crowd did not cheer for her. No one shouted a bid. No one even stepped closer. The auctioneer, a tall insect-like alien with shiny black eyes, slammed his staff on the stage. Lot 39, last one for the day, he called out. A female from the Aral species, young, weak, injured, but still alive. The way he said it made it sound like being alive was the only thing she had to offer. Some buyers laughed, a few turned away, and others muttered insults. She won't last a week, someone said. Not worth the food you'd feed her, another replied. The girl stayed silent, her large eyes staring at the ground, not daring to look at anyone. The auctioneer tried again. Opening bid, 10 credits. No one answered. 5 credits, he said, his voice losing its excitement. Still, no one spoke. The girl's hands tightened around the bars of her cage, her knuckles pale. She knew what happened to those who went unsold. They were sent to the lowest pits, where no light reached, and no one came back. Going once, the auctioneer called. Her heart pounded. Going twice, his voice echoed. She closed her eyes, ready for the hammer to fall. Wait. The single word cut through the noise like a blade. Every head in the market turned to see who had spoken. A human man stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. He was tall, with a strong build, wearing a long coat that had seen better days. His boots were dusty from travel, and his face was calm, though his eyes were sharp. He walked toward the stage with slow, steady steps. From his belt, he pulled a small pouch and tossed it to the auctioneer. It landed with a dull clink. The sound of metal coins inside. The auctioneer opened it, counted quickly, and snorted. This is less than half our starting price, he said. It's enough, the human replied, his voice firm. The insect-like alien tilted his head, then shrugged. Fine. She's yours. Take the worthless thing and go. The human ignored the insult. He knelt beside the cage, looking at the girl for the first time. Her large eyes lifted to meet his. Filled with fear and confusion, she expected cruelty, pain, maybe a mocking smile. Instead, his expression was unreadable, neither pity nor pride. With a quiet click, he unlocked the cage. She didn't move at first, unsure if this was a trick. Come on, he said, his tone softer now. You're coming with me. She hesitated, then slowly crawled out of the cage, her injured leg making each movement awkward. The cold air of the market hit her skin, and she shivered. The human removed his coat and draped it over her thin shoulders. The warmth of the fabric made her eyes sting with something she didn't understand. The crowd murmured as they walked away. Humans are strange, someone whispered. Buying garbage like that? Another chuckled. She kept her head down, her heart confused and racing. No one had ever stepped forward for her before. No one had ever said she was going with them without wanting something in return. They passed. The other cages, the other slaves, watching with dull eyes. Some looked jealous, others simply looked away. The girl glanced back once at the stage, the place she had thought would be her end. Now she was leaving it behind. She did not know where they were going, or why this human had chosen her. But in that moment, she knew one thing. Her story was no longer ending. It was beginning. The market noises faded behind them as the human guided the girl through the dusty streets. His steps were steady, but hers were slow and uneven, her injured leg making every movement a small struggle. She kept her head low, watching the dirt beneath her bare feet. The coat he had given her was far too big, the sleeves hanging past her hands, but the warmth of it made her grip the fabric tightly. She had been cold for so long that even this small comfort felt unreal. The human didn't speak for a while, letting her walk in silence. Now and then, he glanced at her as if checking to see if she would collapse. When they reached a quieter street, away from the crowd, he finally stopped. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, unsure if she should answer. "Lyra," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. He nodded once. "I'm Callan." She waited for the rest, the part where he would tell her what she now had to do for him. That was how it always worked. But he only said, "We need to get you off this planet before anyone changes their mind." She frowned slightly, not understanding. "Why? Why did you buy me?" she asked. Callan's eyes narrowed slightly, but not in anger. "Because no one else would," he said. "And leaving you there didn't seem right." Her heart gave a small, painful thump at his words. In her experience, kindness always had a price. No one gave without taking more later. Still, there was something in his tone, quiet, steady, that didn't sound like a trick. They reached a small landing port at the edge of the city. Ships of different shapes and sizes were docked there, some sleek and new, others patched and rusted from years of use. Callan led her toward a medium-sized freighter, its metal hull marked with old scorch lines from past journeys. The ramp lowered with a hiss of steam, and warm light spilled from inside. She hesitated at the base of the ramp, her bare toes curling against the metal. She had never been inside a ship before, not one that wasn't a prison transport. "Come on," Callan said, walking ahead without looking back. She took a small step, then another, the sound of her footsteps echoing inside the empty cargo bay. The air inside was cleaner than the streets, the faint hum of the ship's systems, a strange comfort. He guided her through narrow hallways until they reached a small room with a bed, a table, and a storage locker. "This will be yours," he said simply. She blinked at him in confusion. "Mine." He nodded. "You'll stay here when we're in space. You'll be safe." The idea of having a space that belonged to her was foreign. In the slave pens, nothing belonged to anyone, not even their names. She sat slowly on the edge of the bed, feeling the softness under her. Her eyes lifted to find him standing at the door. "I'll make some food," he said, turning to leave. When he returned, he placed a steaming bowl in front of her. The smell made her stomach twist. She hadn't eaten real food in so long that it felt both exciting and frightening. She picked up the spoon with shaking hands and took a careful sip. The warmth spread through her body, and she closed her eyes for a moment. Callan didn't rush her, didn't speak. He simply sat nearby, working on a datapad. It was the quietest meal she had ever had, and yet it felt louder than any shouting. After she finished, she set the bowl down and stared at her hands. "You could have bought someone stronger," she said finally. "I didn't need someone stronger," he replied without looking up. "I just needed someone who needed a way out." Her breath caught slightly, the words sinking deeper than she expected. No one had ever cared whether she got out of anything. When night came, Callan showed her how to lock the door from the inside. "You'll be safe here," he told her. She lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling as the ship's lights dimmed, for the first time in years. The chains were gone from her wrists and ankles, and for reasons she didn't yet understand. She believed him when he said she would be safe. The next morning, Lyra woke to the quiet hum of the ship. For a long moment, she lay still, unsure if the safety of the small room was real or just another dream. The blanket over her felt warm, the bed soft beneath her thin frame. It was such a sharp contrast to the cold floor of the slave cage that her chest tightened. She had never woken without the sound of chains clinking or guards shouting. She sat up slowly, her leg aching as always. The smell of something cooking drifted in from the corridor. She hesitated before stepping out. Her bare feet touching the smooth metal floor, the ship's hallway felt narrow, but somehow safe. The dim lights leading her toward the sound. When she reached the small kitchen area, she found Callan standing by a stove, stirring something in a pot. He glanced at her. "Morning," he said casually. She nodded but didn't speak. "Sit," he told her. Gesturing to the chair by the table, she obeyed, keeping her eyes on him, still trying to figure out what kind of man he was. He placed a bowl in front of her, steam rising from it. "Eat while it's hot," he said, then returned to the stove. The first bite warmed her all the way down to her hands. It was a simple meal, but for Lyra, it was a luxury she could hardly believe was hers. She ate slowly, afraid that eating too fast might make it disappear. Callan didn't talk much, only asked if she needed more. When she finished, she whispered, "Thank you," almost as if saying it too loudly might break the moment. After breakfast, Callan showed her around the ship. The freighter was old but well maintained, with a small cockpit, a couple of sleeping quarters, and a storage hold. She noticed that unlike the slave cages, the doors here could be opened from the inside. That small detail made her uneasy. Freedom felt strange after so long without it. In the cargo bay, she ran her fingers over the metal walls, feeling the faint vibrations of the engine. "You can stay in your room, or walk around," Callan said. "Just don't touch the controls in the cockpit without me." She nodded, unsure why he trusted her to wander without supervision. Most masters, no, owners would never allow that. When he went to the cockpit to check flight paths, she found herself standing in the middle of the cargo bay, just breathing in the clean air. It felt like the first time in years she could take a breath without fearing it would be her last. Later, she sat in her room, watching through the small window as the planet they had left grew smaller and smaller. The stars beyond seemed endless, almost frightening in their vastness. She wondered where they were going, and why, but she didn't ask, not yet. For now, she just wanted to feel what it was like to exist without pain for a few hours. That night, she woke suddenly, her body tense. The old fear returned in an instant. She had dreamed of the slave pens again. The darkness in the room felt too much, like the darkness of a cage. She stood, her breathing uneven, and opened her door. The faint glow from the cockpit spilled into the hallway. Callan was there, sitting in the pilot's seat, watching the stars. He looked over as she stepped inside. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. He didn't push her for details, just nodded toward the co-pilot's seat. She sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. They sat in silence for a while, the soft hum of the ship the only sound. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet. "You really don't want anything from me?" Callan turned his head to look at her, his eyes steady. "No," he said simply. "I just don't like seeing people thrown away." His words lingered in her mind, echoing in places she had tried to keep locked. No one had ever seen her as anything but property, until now. For the first time in years, she felt the faint, unsteady beginnings of trust. It was fragile, like a candle flame in the wind, but it was there. And as the ship drifted silently through the stars, Lyra realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. The ship drifted quietly through deep space, the stars outside shining like cold, distant fires. Lyra stayed in her room most of the day, wrapping herself in the oversized coat Callan had given her. She listened to the hum of the engines, the gentle creaks of the old freighter, and sometimes the faint sound of his footsteps in the hall. It was peaceful, yet her mind refused to rest. Memories she wanted to bury kept rising to the surface. She saw flashes of the slave pens, the smell of damp metal, the cries of others locked in darkness, the heavy boots of guards stomping past. Her stomach twisted when she remembered the days they took food away just to watch the captives grow. Weaker, the sound of laughter from cruel buyers echoed in her head. She remembered the day she was dragged onto the auction stage for the first time. Hands bound, head bowed, Every time her eyes met the crowd, she saw nothing but greed and coldness. That night, she woke from another nightmare, her breath coming fast. The shadows in the room seemed to move, like the walls were closing in. She pushed the blanket away and stumbled into the hallway. Her bare feet felt the cool metal under them as she made her way to the cockpit. Callan was there again, leaning back in the pilot's seat, his gaze on the endless dark outside, without a word. He reached over and poured water into a small cup, handing it to her. She drank slowly, the coolness helping her calm down. "Bad dreams?" he asked quietly. She nodded, her voice barely audible. "They don't stop." He didn't tell her to forget them, didn't say it would get better instantly. Instead, he said, "You can talk about them, if you want, for a long time." She said nothing, then the words began to slip out. She told him about her homeworld, a green planet with silver rivers and tall crystal forests. She spoke of the day it was attacked, the fire in the sky, the screaming as soldiers flooded the villages. She remembered hiding under the broken remains of her family's home, only to be pulled out by cold, metallic hands. From that day on, there were no more stars above her, only ceilings of cages and cell walls. Callan listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, but his attention never wavering. He didn't look away when she described the punishments, the hunger, the loneliness. When she faltered, he simply waited, letting her speak again when she was ready. "I thought I'd die there," she whispered, her hands gripping the edge of the co-pilot's seat. "I thought that was all I'd ever be." Callan leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "That's not who you are anymore." The words hit her harder than she expected. No one had ever told her she could be anything other than property. Her eyes stung, and she looked away, not wanting him to see. "Why do you care?" she asked, her tone half curious, half suspicious. Callan shrugged. "Because someone cared about me once, when they didn't have to. It saved my life." She thought about that for a long moment. Maybe that was the difference between him and everyone else she had met. He knew what it was like to be given a chance. They sat together in silence for a while, the stars stretching endlessly before them. Eventually, her breathing slowed, the tightness in her chest easing. Callan stood and nodded toward the hallway. "Get some rest." Lyra, back in her room, she lay on the bed, staring at the faint glow from the small window. The nightmares might come again, but now she knew she didn't have to face them alone. She had no idea what lay ahead, or why fate had put her in this man's path. But for the first time since she was taken from her home, there was a thread of hope woven into the dark. Days turned into a quiet rhythm aboard the freighter. Lyra began to learn the layout of the ship by heart, every narrow hallway and hidden storage compartment. She no longer kept her door locked all the time, and sometimes she even walked to the kitchen without waiting for Callan to call her. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. Callan gave her small tasks, cleaning tools, checking storage shelves, wiping down the control panels. He didn't demand she work, but every time she helped, he simply said, "Good," in a way that made her want to try again. Her limp made certain jobs harder, but Callan never used it as an excuse to keep her idle. Instead, he showed her how to move without straining her leg too much. One afternoon, he even set a small crate in front of her and taught her how to patch a wiring connection. Her hands were clumsy at first, but she watched carefully, copying the way his fingers moved. When she got it right, the system light flickered back to green. A spark of pride warmed her chest. She had done something useful. In the evenings, she sometimes sat in the co-pilot's seat while Callan flew. He explained the basics of the controls, pointing to buttons and switches. She listened quietly, storing the information away even if she didn't think she'd ever use it. Still, a strange thought stayed in her mind. He was teaching her things no master would ever teach a slave. It made her feel more like a person than an object. One night, the calm was broken. The ship's alarm blared suddenly, red lights flashing along the corridors. Callan's voice was sharp over the intercom. "Lyra, stay in your room." But instead of obeying, she moved toward the cockpit, her heart pounding. When she reached it, she saw the flashing radar, 2 pirate ships closing in fast. Callan was already strapping into his seat, hands flying over the controls. The freighter shook as laser fire grazed the hull. "Get back to your room," he shouted without looking at her. But she saw the problem, a small red warning light blinking on the maintenance panel. Something was wrong with the engine coolant line. Without thinking, she ran toward the cargo bay, where the maintenance hatch was. She could hear Callan still yelling, but the ship needed that repair, or they wouldn't get far. Her hands trembled as she pulled open the panel, the hiss of steam rushing past her face. The heat was intense, but she remembered how Callan had shown her to close a faulty valve. She twisted it hard, ignoring the pain in her fingers. The warning light in the cockpit blinked off. The engine hum steadied. A moment later, the freighter surged forward with new speed, breaking away from the pirate ships. By the time Callan appeared in the cargo bay, the danger was fading on the radar. He stared at her for a moment, breathing hard. "You could have been hurt," he said, his voice tight. "But we would have been caught if I didn't," she replied, still catching her breath. His expression softened just slightly. "You saved us." The words hit her with unexpected force. No one had ever said that to her before. For the first time, she felt like she had earned her place on the ship. That night, she sat in her room, her fingers still sore from the heat. The ache in her leg didn't bother her as much. She had done something that mattered, and when Callan passed by and said, "Good work today, Lyra," it stayed in her mind long after he walked away. The girl who had once been ignored in a rusted cage was slowly learning to stand. The freighter drifted into a quiet trade station far from the busy core worlds. Its outer hull still showed the scorch marks from the pirate attack, but the engines were steady. Callan guided the ship into the docking bay, his movements calm and practiced. Lyra stood in the cargo bay, watching the station lights spill in. As the ramp lowered, she had never seen a place like this, not as crowded as the markets, not as hostile as the slave pens, but alive in its own way. Merchants moved between stalls, carrying crates of goods. Engineers walked by with toolkits, their faces marked with grease. No one stared at her the way people had in the slave market. Callan led her through the station's corridors, stopping at a small supply shop to get parts for the ship. She followed silently, her eyes darting everywhere, taking in the colors, the smells, the hum of life around her. When they returned to the freighter, Callan placed the supplies on a table. Then he turned to her, leaning slightly against the edge. "You've been on this ship for almost 2 weeks now," he said. She nodded, unsure where this was going. "You've done well," he continued, "better than I expected." The praise made her shift uncomfortably. She wasn't used to hearing it. Then he said something that made her chest tighten. "You're free now, Lyra." She blinked at him, not understanding. "I bought you out of the market, but I never planned to keep you as property," he said. "You can leave here, go wherever you want, start over." Her stomach twisted. Leave? Go where? She had no family, no friends, no safe place to return to. The thought of walking away from the ship, from Callan, felt like stepping off into a dark void. She looked down at her hands. "And if I want to stay?" she asked, her voice low. Eyes studied her carefully. "Then you stay," he said. "But not as a slave, as my crew." The word felt strange in her ears. Crew. It meant belonging without being owned. It meant having a role without being a prisoner. "You'd trust me with that?" she asked. "You've already proven yourself," he replied simply. Her mind flashed back to the pirate attack. To his words, "You saved us." Something warm settled in her chest. "I want to stay," she said finally, her voice stronger this time. A small smile touched his lips. "Then you stay." They spent the rest of the day repairing the damage to the ship. Callan handed her tools, explaining each step. She listened closely, her hands steady even when the work was difficult. By the time the last panel was sealed, her hair was messy, her fingers sore. But there was a quiet pride in her heart. That night, as they sat in the cockpit, watching the station lights fade into the distance, Lyra felt something she hadn't felt in years. Safety. Not the fragile kind that could be taken away in a moment, but the kind built by trust and choice. She didn't know how long it would last, or where their journey would take them, but she knew one thing. She was no longer the girl in the last cage. She was Lyra, crew of the freighter Endeavor, and her story wasn't ending here. Weeks passed, and the freighter Endeavor became more than just a ship to Lyra. It became a home, something she had once thought impossible for someone like her. The small room that Callan had given her no longer felt like a place to hide, but a place to rest. The narrow hallways that had once seemed strange now felt familiar. Every sound of the engines, like a heartbeat she could trust. She learned more each day. Callan taught her how to read star maps, how to monitor cargo inventory, and how to check the ship's systems before takeoff. She still made mistakes sometimes, but instead of punishment, there was patience. It was a new kind of life, one where every day was not about surviving the next, but about learning what came after survival. One evening, they landed on a desert moon to deliver supplies. The settlement there was small, just a cluster of low metal buildings surrounded by endless sand. Lyra walked beside Callan through the dusty streets, her head high, no chains on her wrists. Some people glanced at her with curiosity, but no one dared to call her worthless. She wasn't the silent, broken figure from the market anymore. Inside the trading post, she handled part of the supply exchange by herself. The merchant, a scaled alien with a sharp voice, tried to overcharge her, but she remembered what Callan had taught her about fair prices. She met the merchant's gaze without flinching. "That's too high," she said, her voice steady. The merchant grumbled, but adjusted the price, and she completed the deal. When they left, Callan gave her a small nod of approval. "You handled that well," he said. A quiet pride swelled in her chest. Not because she had impressed him, but because she had done something she once thought she could never do. Days later, they found themselves back at a busy spaceport. The air was thick with the noise of engines, the shouts of traders, and the smell of fuel and cooked street food. As they walked through, Lyra noticed a group of cages in a corner, fresh captives from some raid. Her steps slowed, her eyes fixed on the faces behind the bars. She saw the same hopelessness she had once, felt the same emptiness. It was like looking into a mirror from the past. Callan noticed her staring and stopped beside her. "We can't save everyone," he said quietly. She nodded slowly, but her eyes stayed on them. "Maybe not everyone," she said, "but we can save someone." Callan studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You're starting to sound like me," he said with a faint smile. That night, as they prepared to leave the port, Lyra stood in the cargo bay, watching the ramp rise. The stars were visible again through the open doors. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the cold, rusted cage to the warm light of the Endeavor, from a forgotten piece of property to a person who could choose her own path. When the ramp sealed shut, she walked to the cockpit and sat in the co-pilot's seat. "Where to next?" she asked. Callan shrugged. "Wherever we want." The words felt powerful, full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. As the freighter lifted from the spaceport and disappeared into the black, Lyra leaned back in her seat. She wasn't afraid of the unknown anymore. She wasn't waiting for someone to decide her fate. She was part of deciding it herself. Her life was no longer defined by chains, by cages, or by the word slave. It was defined by the choice she had made to stay, to learn, to live. The girl left unsold at the auction had been given a second chance, and with every jump through the stars, she was making sure it was a life worth keeping.